So I have been in the Foreign Service for 36 years and basically have been dealing with almost every continent and many different issues, development aid issues, trade issues, security policy, EU policy and so on and so forth. So, I'm very happy to be now the ambassador of the happiest country in the world in the US. You may have noticed from the leaflet that we have been actually ranked the happiest country in the world last year, and just today, this morning, we learned that we have renewed that ranking. So,
which makes us very happy.
But some of you know a little bit about Finns, and there was a very typical reaction when we were told that we are the happiest country in the world, and it was basically that we were stunned. We didn't believe that we would be the happiest people on the earth. And there were a lot of jokes about that, you know, they must have come to Finland to observe us in the summer. And then there was also a joke, you know, if we are the happiest, then the state of the world is certainly worse than I thought. And then also that, well, maybe they have mixed up us again with Sweden. So in any case, that sort of happiness issue is really something special because, well, I'm not old enough to remember when Finland became independent 100 years ago, but 2 years ago we celebrated the centennial of our independence, and I gave a lot of talks about, you know, what this means, and tried to describe the journey we have traveled over those 100 years. 100 years ago, Finland, like the other Nordic countries, was poor, peripheral, and in Finland actually we had, just after the independence, a civil war. And today, all of the Nordic countries, I think you can say, are some of the most successful countries on earth. Not only, you know, measured in affluence, but measured with things like happiness, and so that is quite an achievement, and we are of course very proud about it, but at the same time very humble, and sort of we understand that whatever you achieve, both as a person but also as a nation, it's not self-evident that you will remain in that position. You will have to work for it, and you will have to stay agile, and you will have to try to understand what we need in order to maintain, you know, all of this good that we have. One of the and since we are not too big a group, I think we could easily have a discussion. So if at any point you have any questions, please interrupt. Don't wait until the end of my talk, because I have a tendency not to observe the clock, so we might not have any discussion if you let me talk too long. But so I wanted to talk a little bit about the Nordic countries as such, and Finland being one of them, and what are the strengths of the Nordic countries. Why are we, you know, on top of all these beauty contests that you see? We shouldn't give too much weight to these rankings, but they are some kind of an indication of what our societies are like, and in that sense it might be interesting for everybody to understand a little bit, first of all, that we have not always been successful, rich, affluent, whatnot, stable, but what has brought us here. And if you ask any Nordic, let's say, leader or somebody who has thought about these things, and ask what is the one specific issue that has been a key to this success, I think 95% would say equality. That has been an underpinning of our societies, not only during the past 100 years, but already before that. In other words, we are small nations, and very early on in our respective countries or nations, some kind of an understanding came about that if we want to survive and succeed, we need to tap all the resources of the nation, everybody, both genders, all social groups, and people in faraway regions, not only the cities and so on. So equality as an underlying principle in the society has been extremely important, and I think goes a long way in explaining our relative success. We have, all of us, very strong democracies and very stable societies, and therein lies another important principle. There's a very high level of trust in our societies. We trust each other and as individuals, but we also trust our institutions. Now let's see whether that remains so, because I think this trust and confidence is probably one of the principles that is most under threat in our societies, I mean everywhere in the world at the moment, because there are so many forces and sort of new influences that erode this trust. But we still have a very high level of trust, which then is reflected in the strong democratic tradition and in the stability of our societies. We have a high level of rule of law, which is extremely important for this confidence factor. Then related to the equality is something, again, very, very important, which I think will be also one of the keys in the future everywhere in the world to relative success, and that is the education level of the population. And you may know that Finland is pretty famous for the level of our primary education. It's very high, and it's very sort of equal. I myself come from a small village up in the north, and I had access to as good an education as somebody in the capital coming from totally different kind of circumstances. And I think this real access to high level of education is very much going to be the key, as I said, also especially in the future, when our societies are so much sort of knowledge-based societies. And finally, something that unites all of us, the Nordic countries, is, I think, an interesting feature, and that is that, you might think that up there in the north, small nations, a little bit peripheric, are sort of very inward-oriented. But it's actually the opposite. In all the Nordic countries, the general public is very globally minded. They follow the news, they follow what happens in the world. If you ask a Finn, and we have asked Finnish people quite often, there are all kinds of surveys, what are you most worried about? Can you guess what is the number one issue for an ordinary Finn?
Global warming?
Yes, climate change, and very high on the list of worries for ordinary people is also, for instance, inequalities in the world. So the people are very globally minded in that sense that they understand that our stability and prosperity depends on how the world at large is doing. Now, obviously we are small nations and cannot have a big impact, but we all try to contribute to global issues, and that is one of the cornerstones of the international policies of all of our nations. We want to contribute to solving the big problems in the world. So Finland, I'm talking a lot about the Nordic sort of affiliation and brand, which is natural here, but it is actually very important for Finland because, it is important for small countries to be able to, in very few words, explain ourselves. And the Nordic brand is a very good brand, and actually, as such, already tells a lot about ourselves. One additional feature I should have mentioned, very typical for the Nordic countries, is that we are, because of all the things that I have listed, we are all very innovative countries and open economies and very dynamic economies. And it's an interesting combination of a high level of security and safety, very strong safety nets, but then also a very dynamic economy and a very innovative economy. And this is, I think, one of the sort of the elements that makes the Nordic countries so interesting. How are you able to combine, strong safety net, which is obviously expensive, and still a very vibrant economy? And but then the other affiliations that were already mentioned, which I would just briefly say, the membership in the European Union, we became members in 1995 at the same time as Austria and Sweden. And that membership is very important for Finland for several reasons, and all of you know quite a lot about the European Union, but I would sort of emphasize one particular aspect of what makes the European Union. You don't often think about this, but what makes the European Union so significant. People often think about foreign policy and many other things, but at the core of the European Union there is the single market, which sounds very economic, but it actually means that we have, through common legislation, every day we give some new legislation, because in order to keep up with the developments you have to legislate. Through common legislation we have created this single market or single area where people can move freely, goods can move freely, services can move freely, and capital can move freely. And it's sometimes, you would have to imagine Europe without this single market and the fact that all of these four things can move freely. Only then would you understand how important it is. It's very difficult to explain it. But
and if I can just add something, for example, the Erasmus studies program within the European Union allows all EU citizens to study in each other's universities and they get a stipend for those studies. So we have a very mobile university system.
Yeah. So that kind of really things that have an impact on people, companies, businesses, and also actually act in the way that in order to have this level playing field, things like consumer protection have to be legislated, environmental standards are legislated at the European level, and so on. So it's sort of it at the same time it lifts us all up to a certain level of, for instance, environmental standards. And through this, the European Union is important for us, but this fact that the European Union, over 500 million people, the second biggest economy in the world, the biggest donor of development assistance, that makes us also a big player in the global issues, global arena. And that aspect is also very important for Finland, because we, as I said, we are an open economy, small nations which are very dependent on what are the principles that guide, in the world, well, be it politics or be it economy, trade, environment. And since we are part of the EU, we can influence the EU policies, and then EU can influence the global decisions. So I would just like to leave you with this notion that the EU, it often has this a little bit of not the best of reputations, but it's actually a very fundamental thing that helps us Europeans unite and then play a bigger role in the world arena. And we can talk more about the EU if you are interested. NATO, it was mentioned, Finland is not a member of NATO, and there's a sort of if you ask me the question why, I will struggle a little bit to explain, not because it would be an unfair question, but simply because there are so many sort of reasons. And I think it would be right to say that, well, first of all, one of the reasons is that the majority of the population doesn't support us joining NATO. But it is, that opinion is not against NATO, it simply reflects, I think, the majority feeling that we are okay as we are. Why change our situation? I think that's basically the biggest explanation. But we are very close partners with NATO. Our defense forces, which are actually very strong, one of the strongest defense forces, if you count out UK, France, maybe Italy, one of the strongest defense forces in Europe, in the European Union. We have general conscription, and we have developed our defense forces to be sort of 100% interoperable with the NATO forces. And here again, NATO, of course, is the cornerstone of the European security and defense, but EU is also a cornerstone of the European security, because security is much more than military security. There are so many other aspects there, and those areas are mostly in the competence of the EU. EU is the body that can act if you talk about, for instance, legislation against terrorism or whatever. So NATO, we are not members, but we are partners, and we participate very actively in the different activities, including the NATO operations, which have been initiated in the neighborhood of Europe to help solving certain conflicts. So, for instance, in Afghanistan, in the future also in Iraq, in the Western Balkans, we have been involved in all of those operations. Then one very important, when I was talking about we are globally minded, very important sort of platform for us is all the multilateral organizations. UN, all the different UN organizations, and all the Nordic countries are, we use the term punching above our weight in the UN organizations. And again, the way we see the UN is that, okay, it's not the most efficient organization in the world, but it's the only totally global organization in the world. And that's the place, because in today's world, all the voices have to be heard. And UN is the place where all the voices are heard. And in our opinion, there with these new technologies and all kinds of things that are changing, there is going to be even more demand and need for lack of better word, we call global governance. In other words, it's not really a very good term, because it basically is only about agreeing on some basic rules of the road amongst everybody. So the UN is still very important in that aspect, trying to bring everybody to the table to agree on some rules of the road, be it cybersecurity, be it human rights, be it whatever. And we think that this is very important work and we shouldn't give up, even if it is very difficult. The final affiliation that I would like to mention, or it's sort of not only an affiliation, it's really what we are. Finland is an Arctic country. The Arctic, well, if you go to Finland and to the Arctic Circle, it's very different from the Arctic in the US or Canada. But it is the Arctic, and the importance of the Arctic is growing because of climate change. The climate change in the Arctic, the impact of the climate change in the Arctic is double that elsewhere, and the change in the Arctic accelerates the change elsewhere as far as climate is concerned. So if we want to tackle the climate change issue, we have to do things that have an impact on the Arctic. But the ice is melting, and that means that all the huge natural resources in the Arctic will become more accessible. Also the sea routes, so there's a lot of geo-economic and geopolitical interest to the Arctic. And Finland, being one of the Arctic countries, is a member of the Arctic Council. At the moment we are chairs, but soon giving the gavel to Iceland. And the Arctic Council, there we have the 5 Nordic countries, Canada, US and Russia. And we actually cooperate well together in the Arctic Council on the environmental issues, but also on other issues, search and rescue issues, safety issues, and so on. And that Arctic cooperation is very, very important in our opinion, and we try to promote it the best we can. So these are sort of the let's say the main sort of affiliations and platforms where we operate, and where we try to have impact on how the world looks like, where we try to contribute to solution of problems. If we then zoom back a little bit to Europe, maybe a couple of words about that. We think that, well, obviously Europe is our home. That's what we are, Europeans. And we think, as I said, that Europe is already a big player globally and should be an even bigger player. But we also think that Europe and US are, to a very large extent, very like-minded, and we should combine our forces on many issues. And it is important that the transatlantic link stays strong. We believe that that is very important for the safety and security and stability of Europe, but also it is a big interest of the US when you think about the so-called new global power play. We don't want to emphasize this great power competition too much. It is a fact of life, but we also think that everybody on Earth has so many common interests that yes, we do compete, but we also have to join hands in solving the problems. Then finally, because I have already spoken too long, but finally a couple of words about going back to the climate issues, and maybe a link to the US here, because I'm sure you are a little bit interested how we see the cooperation with the US. We have and we cooperate on many different levels with the US, whichever administration is in power. But of course, the administration in the US, the politics are very sort of, if the administration changes, the politics change, and policies change a lot. That's actually not the case in Finland or most of the other Nordic countries, because we always have a coalition government, so the change tends to be smaller. But here the changes are big, and but we continue to cooperate on the areas where we can, and sometimes it happens that, for instance, what happened with the present administration, all the Nordics had a very strong cooperation with US on climate and environmental issues, and that's not the focus of the present administration, but we still want to continue the cooperation. So with the administration we have a continuous dialogue about, what can we still do together, and then we also have a very sort of try to be active in the states like California, which has a very active environmental policy, and try to sort of innovate a little bit how to continue the cooperation with different actors. So that is one important area where all kinds of contacts and links, including between universities, are very important.